On behalf of the committee, a tremendous thank you to our Labour partners and particularly to the Pay Equity Coalition, which has been pushing hard on this really since 2004. They testified before committee and provided significant detailed amendments. I am not going to, and the NDP is not going to move anything that has not gone through that filter. We've done our best to try to take their advice to committee and turn it into our amendments. In our NDP 14, it is captured two significant errors that were identified by the coalition. The first is the purpose clause of the Pay Equity Act. And they said very clearly the current purpose clause is not acceptable as a human rights and as a pay equity statute. That is particularly because Section 2 contains the qualifying phrase, in quotes, while taking into account the diverse needs of employers. And the first part of our amendment deletes that clause. The witnesses said very clearly there's no reference to the diverse needs of employers in the Canadian Human Rights Act. And the current draft of the purpose clause is unforeseen in Canadian human rights legislation. And it does not recognize Canada's commitments to human rights and its international obligations. That the needs of the fundamental human right for all genders to be paid equally for work of equal value, for it to be screened through the needs of employers is unprecedented and significantly limits the fundamental human rights to have such a qualification. The witnesses said to the committee, anybody who felt comforted, if the intention of the language of that qualification was to acknowledge that there are diverse types of employers with different realities and structures in the federal jurisdiction, the witnesses said that that objective is accomplished in the operational sections of the Act. There are different provisions for different sizes and different types of employers, processes for unionized and non-unionized workplaces, and other types of flexibility built into the regulation. So the strong advice from the witnesses was to do A in this amendment, to remove that qualification. Then the second piece, as captured in B of our amendment, is to include in the purpose clause the requirement for pay equity to be clearly and directly spelled out in the body of the Act to ensure that the obligations and responsibilities are known to the parties. And they said that this was consistent with the recommendations of the 2004 Task Force, Recommendation 8.2, which set out that the new federal legislation provide that the employer is responsible for ensuring that pay equity implementation and maintenance are free of gender discrimination. And Ontario's Pay Equity Act sets out those same obligations. So I'm hoping that the committee will take the advice of all of the Labour parties that testified to committee, and most particularly the advice of the two human rights lawyers who appeared before you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Anyone else in this discussion? And I remind people that officials from ESDC here, if there's any questions to officials on any of these points. Mr. Sabara.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to all the officials here today. The BIA legislation, yes, does set out pay equity guidelines and brings forth pay equity, which is one of the things that we can be very proud of as a government and as a committee that we get the chance to examine. It's been talked about for a long time, and even as I stated yesterday in the House, equal pay for equal work, or equal pay for the same duties, whether a man or woman, is something fundamentally that we believe in. With regard to the amendment brought forward, and Member Malcolmson, I did hear as well the concerns regarding the comments or the 4 or 5 words of the diverse needs of employers. I did hear those comments during Finance Committee testimony. I will say that I disagree in terms of the amendment. I disagree in terms of the interpretation of the diverse needs of employers. That does not in any way weaken or weaken the legislation in terms of what the legislation purports to do in terms of bringing forth pay equity legislation. I just read my notes, the mention of diverse needs of employers in the Act appropriately recognizes that the Act establishes different obligations on employers based on size and union presence, and that the substantive rights that flow from the actual provisions of the statute are still valid. So the reference to diverse needs for employers does not create in any sense or any form or any shape a loophole for employers. I will be voting against the amendment brought forward by the honourable member from British Columbia, and I wanted to lay out my reasons why I will be doing so. Thank you, Chair.
Go ahead, Ms. Malcolmson.
Thank you, Chair. With respect to my Liberal colleague's comments, he is rebutting head-on the advice that we got from the Canadian Labour Congress, from the Pay Equity Coalition, from Teamsters, from CUPE. These are organizations that, since well before 2004, have been working with pay equity legislation in Ontario, for example, which has legislated this since the 80s. They've got extensive experience. Jan Borovoy and Faye Faraday, you won't find human rights lawyers that have worked harder on and have argued the case law that has got us to this place. That postal workers fought the courts for 30 years because of the absence of federal pay equity legislation means we have significant case law that says this is what the first Prime Minister Trudeau's commitment in 42 years ago to legislate pay equity, and the fact that it has not been proactive means that it has been fought in the courts again and again. This is why this is a good initiative of this government to finally legislate proactive pay equity legislation. To have the members say he's going to vote down these amendments, arguably the most important in this whole Finance Committee deliberation. If you want this legislation to work for women and not have it revert back to the courts again and again, why on earth would you qualify the rights of women to receive equal pay for work of equal value? And to have had every one of these Labour witnesses say that you need to make this change. The witnesses said this language undermines the intentions of the Act, which is to address systemic gender wage discrimination. It undermines the human right of equal pay for work of equal value. This was their testimony. They said the Task Force on Pay Equity in 2004 recommended the government enact new standalone proactive pay equity legislation in order that Canada can more effectively meet its international obligations and domestic commitments, and that such legislation be characterized as human rights legislation, end quote. And so, if you believe in that recommendation, you cannot qualify the human rights of women to receive equal pay by referring to the diverse needs of employers when the diverse needs of employers are addressed in another section of the legislation which does not undermine the human rights of women.